Welcome to the Master's Class. This is Nick Begich, and we have a lot to cover today. The hidden monks. You're the hidden monks. We're all the hidden monks, and really that's where the story begins. And a lot of big changes for me have been coming in the last few months, and I don't have a script, but boy, do I have a lot of notes that we're going to get through today, and we have a long day in front of us. But first, I want to give my formal introduction. It's Nicholas John Begich, and I'm the eldest son of Peggy and Nicholas Begich. I was born here in Alaska. My name means Nicholas, Victorious Army, John, by the grace of God. I have two other names. I was adopted twice Athabascan. My clan grandmother, Katie Wade, gave me the name Kuska, which means chief or leader. My sister, Danita Peter Clausen, gave me the name Nabuquinishin, which means the one who speaks up for us. The two villages that my name is represented by is Chicxulub and Tyonek. And these are villages within the Cook Inlet region, which is where we are today, here in Anchorage, Alaska. The Hidden Monks is really all about you. It's about us, about what we do in the world and whether or not we're going to just continue in kind of this pattern that we've been in for an awful long time, or whether we're going to reset. And I've had my own personal big reset lately. And one of the issues that really settled in me was this concept of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And really whether any of us are really having that these days. And you know, when I think about my friends, yeah, sure, there's a few, maybe. But the amount of anxiety, stress, the things happening in the world today really have pressed down on us in a way that probably hasn't been ever. When you look around the world, the typeset, sort of the cultural context in which everything's been shut down, and things have happened gradually. I travel a lot. I've traveled all over the world. So we're going to get into a lot of issues, but I want to also thank the team that tried to put all this together, and it is a team effort. We've had a lot of volunteers. I've had some professionals, and we're working in a real short timeline to cover an awful lot of material, and I just appreciate that. You know, the last 50 years has been scholarship from the time I was 12, and we're going to get into all of that. But we've had that little bit of an introduction to my family, and I know we've had a few stops and starts there, so I don't know what all got covered. But I want to give a little background on the family history, my personal history, as a starting point today, to really begin to sort of open up who is this guy that's talking, and where does he come from in terms of background? Because I've lived a very different life. But let me talk about my dad a little bit. My dad came here, he was pretty young, in his early 20s, a teacher, a principal. He had all of those attributes. But the big things he did in legislation here at the very beginning, just after statehood, all of the education legislation, the things that set in motion what schools would look like, how they'd be funded, the first public kindergarten, the first special ed classes, rural health, the first big initiatives in rural health, and what was going on in Alaska in the 1950s and early 1960s. The average age of a Native American, 40 years old, maybe a little older, maybe a little younger. People had seen a lot of death no matter where you lived in Alaska. And my dad flew everywhere. He flew to every single village virtually in this state at one point or another. And it was always the same. It was always the same. And he grew up poor. He knew what poor was, but even he had never seen what was happening in rural Alaska in the early 1960s. Appalachia was an improvement for what was happening here. And a lot of people don't know it, but even to this day, 2021, we still have 30 of our villages don't have running water. They don't have sewer. They're still hauling their septic in buckets to lagoons. But we're building toilets all around the world with your tax dollars, but not here. The things Dad did, education, as I said, was a big thing. Collective bargaining, retirement systems for public employees, all that was his legislation. And he was known as Mr. Education because that was his background, and that was where he felt things could really change. In rural Alaska, there had been lawsuits right around that time to create an equalization in education. So they had to figure out a way to do this. You know, how are you going to deliver education when you don't have roads, you don't have anything, you don't have any infrastructure. And that's where we were, and that's where I was growing up in Anchorage. Native land claims, when he made it to Congress, that was his big thing. In the first year, he passed the largest native land claim settlement in the history of the United States. In the first year, in a Congress where Alaska has one representative. Yeah, we're a big state, but in Congress it's all about population, and we have the smallest population of any state. So consequently, he had to do the work, convince 435 of his colleagues that some things were good ideas. Native land claims was one of them. We'll talk more about that later. The Marine Mammal Protection Act that many people remember, that was his legislation with the exemptions for Alaska Natives to be able to deal with marine mammals in the manner in which they had for thousands of years. And you'll see art around my house as we go through the day of some of that. The other oil pipeline had to get done here. You know, that was a big thing back then. In order for it to get done, they had to settle the titles, the land titles, and ours weren't settled here. The state hadn't finished its selections, the native land claims hadn't been done. Really not much had been done here, and we'll get more into that later. He also got an amendment to the Jones Act for a vessel in Alaska. I don't believe anyone ever has since or before. We'll talk more about why that's important. And the other thing was the Clean Water Act, which also had certain exemptions for Alaska. All that happened in 71, 72 in my dad's first year in Congress, and that was when Earth Day happened, was right around the same time. A lot was going on in D.C. Back then. You know, when you think about the early 70s, we got there in 1970. And just to kind of give the backdrop, because it was similar to the backdrop of 2020 and 2021. You know, we had a lot of unrest. We had the end of the Vietnam War. We had impeachment of Nixon being talked about. Watergate hadn't quite broke, but right after the election, it certainly did. The second election of Richard Nixon. The protests back then were wild. You know, 9,000 people were arrested and put in JFK Stadium, not a few hundred, 9,000, because they were 100,000 were marching down the other way on Pennsylvania Avenue during the inaugural parade. People don't remember it, but I do, because I was there. You know, I was pretty young, but I remember it. You know, when I think about what else happened, China opened up, the gold window closed, we had the oil shortage. If you remember, some will remember, we had inflation double digit, and we had mortgage rates jumping up to 12 and 14%, believe it or not. All of that history, again, the backdrop of where we were. The CIA, the FBI had their chops beaten in by the church committee. Many will remember that. Again, history was happening, a lot of things, violations of our security agencies against American people was going on, same as now. Warren Commission, Kennedy's investigation, all being thought about again at that time, because there were some things people thought hadn't been done right. Congress had been violated by the FBI. Everybody tapped their mail, infiltrated. Hale Boggs was the Speaker of the House at the time. The Majority Leader at the time, and headed for the Speaker position. When I think about all those guys, and where were they at right then, was at a real critical crossroads where things could have been way different. And instead they went a much different way. And we'll get into that as we get into the day. My mom, she went on, she did a lot of things after my dad disappeared. He was lost on a plane in 1972, just before the election, the second election of Richard Nixon. He was lost with Hale Boggs, the Majority Leader at the time. Powerful people disappeared on a small plane flying from Anchorage to Juneau, and not a trace officially ever found. And we'll get into that perhaps a little bit later too. But my mom, as national committee woman, later a couple times, ran even a couple times for my dad's seat. Never did make that, but stayed active in the party up until the early 90s, when press reports came out that perhaps my dad's plane had been located and just never recovered. That was pretty disturbing. Mom left Alaska. She gave up politics. The rest of us stayed in it. And my brother Mark at the time had been on the assembly a number of times. He had served 3 terms. Twice he had served, as time went on, as mayor of Anchorage, and eventually United States Senator from Alaska, now involved in business here. My brother Tom, he ran probably 100 campaigns for other people, worked in a bunch of different places. He was organizing juvenile justice for 9 different states all the way, including Guam, and worked for the Department of Justice, organizing juvenile justice courts and kind of ways to deal with young people. He worked 5 years in the indigenous world here also. He also worked 5 years for IBW as a pollster and involved in a lot of their work. But Tom now is in the state senate representing downtown Anchorage. In fact, he had the easiest election of any Begich. The first time he ran, he had an opposition in the primary and went on to win. And the second time he ran, nobody bothered to run against him at all. And so Tom knows what he's doing. People like him, and he does a good job in Juneau. My sisters, Nichelle and Stephanie, both went into education, followed my dad's work there. Nichelle became a principal, 2 different schools. She dealt with the toughest kids around, and before that, she dealt with pregnant teens for 25 years within the context of the school system. She had 2 degrees, a master's, eventually 2 degrees, a master's in social work and a master's in education. She also managed a school at the prison here for kids between 16 and 26 that didn't make it and kids that dropped out, and probably helped several thousand people in her career. My sister Stephanie started elementary school teacher, went up, became a teacher expert, training other teachers how to teach and deliver a decent educational product. My brother Paul, the youngest of all, he had a career in retail, has done a lot there. He's a very creative person, set up a bunch of stores for my sister-in-law at the airport, and did a lot of work for Nordstrom's over a 20-year career with them. And that's my family, you know, and when you think about it, and my dad, I think about my dad and the people around us and what I was doing as a little kid. As a little kid, where you would find me and my brothers was hiding behind the couch, and that was kind of a phrase, hiding behind the couch. We were listening to all of these conversations. You know, in the early days, it was teachers and educators and political people when a state was being formed. And later it was Carl Elbert, the Speaker of the House, Hubert Humphrey, because he was a friend of my dad's from when my dad was a teenager and worked on his very first campaigns in Minnesota. You know, all these people were around us, and we were listening, and we were paying attention, and the world was being shaped in a way that is very different. You know, growing up, for me, I heard phrases like from people recently that kind of surprised me. I was in a conversation just less than a year ago with someone really close to me, and they said, well, we can't do anything about that. And it was in the context of some big issue in the world, and I thought to myself, well, I can, and so can you. And that's the point. When I grew up, I didn't think that you couldn't. And really until like that moment, I really didn't think much about it. It was like an assumption, like breathing. You know, if you breathe, you don't really talk about it much, unless maybe you live in Beijing and you're choking on air. That's not good for you. But short of that, certain assumptions that we all make, actually, we may go a very long time. I'm 62 years old. We may go a very long time before we say, oh, wow, that was an assumption, not real. It was a belief, it wasn't real. Stop and think about it, even in the context of the simplest things. But I want to talk about when things really changed for me, because as a teenager growing up, and as a young person, and my mom would tell you, you know, when Dad disappeared, he was just 40, and Mom was 34 with 6 kids. And not the simplest of kids, as you can tell by our sort of snapshot resumes. We were pretty independent in every single way. And I'd say something about that. The same things that make a kid independent thinking and creative thinking will either lead them to leadership with the right mentoring, or you'll be a master criminal, because creativity happens, and kids, I saw so many kids I knew that had all the potential that my brothers and sisters and I had, but just a different circumstance within their family configuration. But they just didn't know they could do anything, so they didn't. They just didn't know they had possibilities, so they didn't. They just didn't know that there were things possible. And when it dawned on me, the first big shock, my dad and I had a lot of clashes, pretty rebellious kid, because I really was independent. When he disappeared, it was a different thing. It wasn't like a death and a funeral. It was just gone. So for me, that was like my big reset. As a teenager, I was at 14 at the time. And for me, without a conclusion, it made me just kind of rethink everything. And I'll say I went from a C/D student to straight A's. Not because I was a genius, it was because I was more perseverant. I decided something different. And so Dad, what he couldn't do for me alive, the one thing he really wanted me to do is take it all more seriously, he got that. And I say this in this sense. For me, it represents both tragedy and at the same time, transformation. And I want to be careful about that, because death is that. And what I observed then as a young person was that around me, people were definitely falling apart in lots of different ways, because nobody had any certainty. But I think about afterwards, their time goes on and you kind of figure that it's not going to sort out the way you planned it. About 30% of people never kind of got over it, and about 70% did. So arbitrarily, that was kind of my number in my head as a 14-year-old was, you can do this now or you can do this later, but whatever trauma you're in, you can use it as your time for reconsideration and transformation. And that's what I did. And I did. My mom cried about it because I said, look, I'm done being a child. I'm not doing that anymore. And she knew I meant it. She told me recently, she cried about it, but I was serious about it. And I always had certain interests young. I was involved in business really young. And I took things seriously. In fact, one of the first books I read, I'll pull off the shelf for a second, because it did make a difference to me, and it made a big difference to me in the context of this book. This book, Think and Grow Rich, I read it when I was 12, and some people that were Amway dealers, and everybody who did Amway knows about it. I was 12 years old, but they saw something in me that was really unique and different. And then I read that book, and I thought, well, they were pretty serious about it, and this is a couple years before my dad passed away. And so I read the book, but I was 12. I didn't understand the vocabulary. So I read it again, only this time, every time I didn't understand a word, I looked it up. So that took a little longer. And then I read the book again, because now I understood the vocabulary. And then I wrote the book. I wrote 36 pages at 12 of my own words right in that book. And why did I do that? Well, I decided to be successful, not the rich part, but it was really about being successful. And I went on to read his other two books, which I don't think the Amway people read. And one was called Laws of Success. It was a big, thick book, and it was really good. And then the other one was called Grow Rich with Peace of Mind, which was a little thin book again, but I don't think the Amway dealers were reading that one either, because about midway through it, Napoleon Hill, the writer, has this little spiritual encounter that kind of blew his mind. And I don't think the Amway dealers had read that one. But I just say that to be a little bit funny, because what was there was a lot of ideas about a way of being, a way of thinking that this guy from the 30s and 40s and 50s, when he was doing his work, had pointed out. And as a 12-year-old, it made sense to me. One of the principles he had was mastermind. I'm going to get into that later, because I used it all my life. I still use it to this day. And a lot of other principles that are there that I'm going to get into later in the discussion. My life as a kid was traveling around with my mom, because she'd throw all of us in the back of a station wagon and leave Alaska and travel all around the country. And we learned a lot that way. Imagine 6 kids in the back of a station wagon, if you're driving around, what that might have been like for a couple of months. But it taught us a lot about a lot. You know, if you stop and think about getting along, about the things you see and what you learn in communicating with a lot of people. And so it was really a good thing. But again, I took life pretty seriously. At 16, I was married my first time. I was married 10 years. A lot of people don't know that aspect of me. I had my first child, Nicholas, when I was 19, a few years later. And I graduated high school early. I jammed it in a little faster and did a lot of other things. I opened a jewelry store when I was 14. I had it for a couple years, into 16, and then I kept it until I graduated high school at 17, and then I went to work on the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, which was a whole nother deal, you know, and I did that. I wanted to be a part of that. You know, I had the jewelry business when I was doing the pipeline thing, and I worked in some wild places. A lot of people don't know that about me. Imagine being 17, showing up in a camp with 1,200 men and 10 women, and then your first day on the job is you go in and you see the guys and you weigh 120 pounds and you're wearing enough clothing so you look like you weigh about 240, and they say, hey, we're going to work down at the heliport. And you think, oh, I'm a fuel handler, I'm going to fuel helicopters. Nope, that was the way I was going to work, because I got dropped off on the fourth deepest construction grade in U.S. history at the time with 5-gallon buckets, a helicopter dropping 450-gallon tanks. And I was fueling fuel on Thompson Pass during the pipeline for that very end of it. And then I was up north doing a little bit with some hydro testing crews up there until just before the oil started flowing. In fact, over here on the shelf, in fact, I'll go to it because it's kind of interesting as I walk through the resume, because it's also part of the history of the state. You know, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline at its peak produced 2 million barrels of oil a day. 2 million barrels of oil a day, tremendous amount. This is from the Manhattan. This was the icebreaker. It was the icebreaker that first went up there and got a barrel of oil off of the North Slope, and this was given to my dad when he was in the Congress. And so I still have it. That's my belt buckle from Associated Green, the company I worked for up north when I was working at a place called Franklin Bluffs, where they discovered oil recently, by the way, and gas. And back here are my dispatches. I actually have them, my dispatches from my Teamster call and my A card from the Teamsters Union that I was in at the time. You know, I keep it all. It's like part of my history. And I've always kept my history close, because to me, a lot of people don't even have that possibility. And the fact that they haven't even kept track of it. So young, I'm doing things. My interests were gemology and minerals and business that was associated with that. And so the jewelry store gave me that kind of outlet. But I was real curious, and the people I hung around with were all older than me. They were between like usually 40 and 70, so I've lost a lot of people in this lifetime. But at the time, my mentors were saying, go to the Gemological Institute, study there, you know, because they really can help you. And they had an independent study. I did it through them. And then that's really where my interest in the sciences took off, because earth sciences were the beginning of it. But I also learned a few things. I apprenticed as a silversmith, so I can do that too. And again, you know, growing up, I had a lot of different experiences, but the physics became interesting when I studied gemology, because I was studying crystals, crystallography, the physics of light as it relates to that. All of that became very interesting to me, and as I walk through today, we'll get back into some of that science and what it simulated even that far back. But science wasn't easy. None of it was easy. And what I learned, one of the tricks I learned, and it's a good key for everyone, is if you want to learn a new subject, start with the language of the subject. Start with the back of the book, the glossary, and just read it and study that. Because if you have the language of the science, or the language of the economics, or the language of whatever it is you're studying, you'll have 90% of it just in the words. And so that's important as you're building knowledge. Think about the words that build that knowledge, because that's what I've done all my life. Think about it. And then I figured out why I did that. I didn't figure out until late in high school that I'm dyslexic. So I read things and flip them around. So you have to drill down deeper if you have that. And I'm glad no one discovered it earlier. They would have given me some kind of a handicap title that would have slowed me down, I'm sure. Instead, they figured it out late, great, and I didn't let it bother me too much, but it did have an effect on my learning. I'll tell you where it showed up. All my test scores off the charts all the time, you know, especially reading, comprehension, understanding things, sourcing things. But spelling, I graduated high school spelling at 5th grade, and I graduated honors 19 out of 485, a year early than a year ahead of everyone else because I had to do more classes, and I was married my last 2 years and running a jewelry store and working another job. So yeah, you can do it if you're perseverant and you don't sleep much, and it makes people nervous when I do that these days because I can. But again, I was gaining knowledge, and I love knowledge. If I could have stayed in school my whole life, I would have. And what I wanted to do, really, if I think back on it, if I could have chosen, I would have been a scholar. And what I realize now after all these years, I was, because I always read 40 or 50 hours a week. And my favorite picture, I think they showed in the pre-shots, were me sitting on a pile of books, reading books at 2 years old, or at least flipping through them. And that's who I've been, you know, when I think back on all the stuff I've read. The library next to me that would be going through is, you know, maybe 1,000 volumes between this one and the one in the back. And out of that, that's like 10% of what I've read in books. And I've read maybe 100,000 in different articles, scientific articles and others. And just, I read all the time. And then I have conversation with a lot of interesting people, from legislators and political people, business leaders, you know, PhDs in any number of sciences, Nobel Prize winners. I mean, I travel a lot, I meet a lot of people, and I maintain relationship because that's what really life is more about. But leaving the pipeline work and the trades work, kind of at the end of that, I'd been reading a lot. I read a lot in the sciences at the time, and I started reading in the parasciences, parapsychology, a lot of that then. Got very interested in that, probably read 1,000 volumes in religion, occult, parascience, physics, chemistry at the time, and got pretty excited. And then I was hanging out with some friends in Florida, and I met somebody down there that owned a very large company. They got me involved in, wanted to get me involved in this thing called the International Biorhythm Research Association. And I ended up showing up at 19 years old for a meeting. I won't go into the long story on it, but I ended up showing up for a week-long meeting, and my job there was to make a little presentation, and then at the same time, or present a paper is what they call it, right? It's what we make it straight for science. You got to present a paper is how they do it. So my paper was on contrasting the way the former Soviet Union at the time and the United States pursued research, because within the context of military research, advanced research in the United States at the time, we use compartmentalization. You know, we kind of split everything up into the smallest little bite so no one would ever see what the other guy was doing. And so a lot of times we'd duplicate things. I mean, very inefficient when you do it that way, and I knew that at 19, although the rest of the government was doing something different. I wasn't in the government at the time. I was kind of watching it from having been in the inside, but now watching from the outside a bit. But the other thing, when I think about the U.S. side being so inefficient, the Russians did it so different, the Soviets. What they did is integrate science. They took all these people from all these very different areas and put them all together. And think about it. How did they keep up with the science? They didn't have the productive capacity. They could barely build anything over there. My mom was there in a diplomatic passport in '71. I remember the conversations coming back. And hey, it was amazing that they could do a lot of things at that time, because the productive capacity was limited, but the scientific knowledge and the intellect and how that had been configured, I thought that looked way ahead of us, because they were developing science in some really interesting ways. So that was my presentation. One of the things I had read at the time was Ostrander and Schroeder's work, which they had just completed, Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain, which was an analysis of what was going on in all of Eastern Europe from the inside, relative to a whole bunch of areas of science. And things were pretty exciting. Eyeless sight, the idea blind people could move their hands across paper like this and distinguish letters, color, all of that. And so when I think about that particular time, Ibra wanted me to look at what was going on within this configuration of scientists. Did anyone there have something that could be commercialized? And the company behind that was International Horizons Corporation in Atlanta. And they'd been involved in selling first encyclopedias in Japan, later language tools for learning English for Japanese children. Very successful company, doing about $100 million a year in sales. After that, they got into the biorhythm research, which is these three physical rhythms that the body is associated with. And so they built the first computer calculator that did those calculations. And then they brought all these experts together from all over the world, and that was this conference that I was at. So the guys that I was meeting then were all interesting, but there was one in particular, and this guy, Reiho Michaela, he'll come up later because he became one of my mentors in sciences. He was an electrophysiologist. His area of expertise was that. He graduated University of Madrid in 1958. I'll bring him up again. He was also a physicist, later became an acupuncturist. He understood Chinese medicine and chemistry, physics, and biophysics, physiology. All of that was his context, and he truly was a genius. And he became one of my mentors. But I met him in that conference. The way that happened, when I was at that age, I always carried 2 suitcases when I travel, one with my clothes and one full of books, and you can guess which one was the heavy one. And so it's just the way I did it, because I was always reading. I needed a bunch of books. And so I ended up in this conversation with him, and I had a pretty baby face at the time. And he just wouldn't take me serious until they stuck me next to him at the banquet, and he didn't really get a choice. And it was a conversation. I remember really clearly what I was asking him about, and then he paid attention. What I asked him was about sound waves, like my voice. And we're going to talk a lot about the voice as we get into this today. And sound waves, when they come out from you, they form energy. And my question was, could you create, with sound waves, create what are called standing waves, where things interfere with each other and they just kind of sit there? And could you do that in such a manner as to create three-dimensional shapes in space in front of you, or in a way that you could then use to take that geometry and apply it to things like living organisms, like stimulating plant growth? And that's what I asked him in that way. And that got his attention, because to ask that question, you had to know a whole bunch of other things to get you there. And then he was interested. And he wants to see what I'm reading. So all right, so that night I ended up giving him a little stack of books. And the next morning he meets me really early for breakfast, and he's got them all dog-eared. He'd read them all that night, because he really was a genius. He read a lot faster than I did. And then we had a real conversation going, and we kept that conversation going for about 2 years after the conference. And my problem at the time was I didn't have enough mixed science to translate this man sufficiently for the guys that really were trying to commercialize ideas, right? I mean, he had them, and I couldn't bridge the conversation. I didn't speak the language sufficiently. Now think about that. I didn't speak the language sufficiently. So I went on and did other things. I lost track of Reiho. He comes back into my life 20 years later when I decided to chase him down. But I went on, I did some things, as I left the pipeline and left that period of my life, I did some things in mining and did some things there with 10 other guys, my first mastermind, which I'll talk about later. But in that, I ended up just failing miserably, lost a couple $1 million and had to start again at 21. I left Alaska, I hitchhiked out of here with $101 and ended up in Irving, Texas with my first wife's aunt and uncle. We stayed there for a bit, and till I could organize myself. And I worked there for Texas Instruments for a year. I worked in the equipment group. We built missiles and drones back then. This would be 1980. And what we were building then, I was on the pre-production for the HARM missile program. So we built the computer section and the avionics sections for them. For the first 12 of those, it went to White Sands for testing. And in the facility we were in, it was the most modern electronics factory in the world at the time, and in the US until about 2000 when they built factories similar. So I had a chance to work in a really interesting environment with a bunch of really smart people. And at the time, I didn't have any credentials, so I'm coming in sort of at the bottom. But I was in production control, and I worked with about 100 engineers, and I learned really fast. So I learned a lot while I was there. And then I went on and I worked for a plastics company in the area in Dallas for about a year. And what I did there was kind of re-engineer all of their OEM, the original equipment manufacturer parts. I went through and kind of redid a bunch of things they had going there. And at the same time did their purchasing, organized their inventories, and set up kind of their system for that. And then I realized I had to do better. I was better off in school because I was below the poverty line for 3 years in Dallas with 2 kids. A lot of people don't know that about me. I could have chose differently. I could have come back to Alaska and could have been employed a lot better, but there were reasons I felt I needed to be there. As I said, I just failed in my business and failed myself and a lot of my friends, and that was a big hit. And the failing for me was lack of knowing, lack of knowledge, and a very powerful voice, you know, the voice that I'm using even today. And what I realized is a voice and doing without wisdom is a big mistake. And so what I went to do in Dallas for 3 years is get that figured out a bit. And so I was active in my church back then, and I was praying for wisdom for 3 years. That's something you might want to think about if you ever do it, because you might also ask for grace, because after that, the learning becomes really interesting, and the path to a little measure of wisdom, and I think I got a little measure, is a painful one every time. And we're going to get to a point where I'm going to take a short break because we've gone a long distance, but I want to cover a couple more things, and then I'm going to come back into my experience. But let's take a short break, and we'll be right back in just a couple of minutes. And I left off talking when I was still living in Dallas, and at that time then I'd been there 3 years. I'm trying to get home. And now that's a challenge when you're living below the poverty line, and then you decided you do better off with scholarships going to college. So I was in college at the moment and thinking about how am I going to get home, and I have 2 kids and I got to figure it out, and I'm going to drive. All right, that's a long way from Dallas to Anchorage, and it's and my wife at the time, she says, well, I'm ready to go, and it's December. So I'm saying, all right, we're out of here, you know, we're getting out of here. And so January comes around, and we're driving north. But before I could make all that happen, I had to figure it out. And so a couple things I did. Actually, I designed a product, and then I had the guts to go into Neiman Marcus and meet one of their buyers. And remember now, I don't have anything to make anything happen, but I did. I designed a couple things. I designed a package and took a game, a simple game, because I had this jewelry business background, you know, and so people who are old as I am remember marbles as a kid, and they used to make them out of real stone. They made them out of agates. And so I had some guys in India give me a little sample. I managed to save $12, I think was the total amount to get that sample. And then what I was able to do is learn how to work a sewing machine, design a package, type something up, take it into Neiman's, and meet their buyer. And I actually walked out with a purchase order, not just for what I was selling, but also a package design for Neiman Marcus. Now, there are a lot of people in the design business would love to have that opportunity, and I walked into it, walked out with it. I went, now I got to go fill this order, and I don't have any money. And so what did I do? You know, I went to the bank, of course, with a little proposal. But in the meantime, I got to go back a little bit. For another thing I did is I decided to design some Christmas stockings, so I did. The kind you put things in, you know, and you hang by the fireplace. So I designed 12 of those, and because I learned how to work a sewing machine, I went ahead and made 12 samples and got them into Nordstrom's buyer, and that was a little bit of help from my brother Paul, make sure they'd see them. And guess what? They gave me a PO too, so now I had two POs. I had a purchase order from Neiman Marcus and one from Nordstrom's. How much better does it get when you're starting out in the retail manufacturing business? You know, and that's me. But I've got no money to fill the orders, so I take my proposal to the bank, a little 4-page thing, and the banker looks at it and goes, well, you know, it looks good, but how do you know you're going to sell it? I said, well, I've already sold everything here. And I showed him the POs, and a few more details had to be worked out, but that was pretty much it. And then I was able to fulfill those orders and do a few other things. And as an entrepreneur, put enough money together in that 90 days I had to deliver, to get the product delivered, get paid, and have enough money to head back to Alaska. And that's how I ended up back here, you know. And then I ended up in the oddest of things. I was a project manager for a construction company for a little while, but I'd been around that. My dad, back when he was in the state Senate, you know, we were pretty poor then too. And so what he was doing back then to make enough money, because he was superintendent of schools and in the state Senate at the same time. And what they said is there was a lawsuit, and it was Rasmussen and a bunch of other people at the time got together and fought him, and they said he had to quit one of the jobs. And he had 4 kids at the time, not 6, but he had to quit one of the jobs. So he's going to quit the superintendent job. It paid $18,000 a year, and keep the Senate job, which paid $6,000. Well, even in the early 60s, the math doesn't work out so well. And so my dad had to figure it out, and so he learned how to build an apartment building. And what he did is he got a piece of land, 2.5 acres. A teacher friend of his who was a surveyor cut it in half. My dad gave half to the guy that taught him how to be a builder. And that guy taught him how to do it all, from the foundation to the shingles, you know, to the top. And he did. He built a 5-unit place, 4-bedroom apartment on one side and 4 1-bedrooms on the other. And those 1-bedrooms paid for all the whole show. But the banks wouldn't work with us here either. And they had a real chokehold on everyone. And so it had to be funded through a small S&L and one of the union pension and retirement trusts, because nobody would finance people like my dad, because they didn't want them in leadership. They didn't want them involved in anything. The reason they fought him in the lawsuit, they thought for sure with all those kids he was going to quit the Senate and be a superintendent. He'd just go away, because that's how it works, ladies and gentlemen. My dad wasn't a rich man. He arrived here pulling a trailer with $11 and a job. And that's it, you know. I mean, but this place had opportunity, and Alaska still has opportunity, and so should the whole country. And that's something I hope we can rekindle as we walk through the day. But I ended up in some working in the trades, and in fact, I built a house, and not this one in particular, but I did build one from the ground up and did the excavation, put in the water and sewer lines, hooked them up to the city, and did the foundation and took it all the way up to the shingles. And I had a little help here and there because I had to learn a few things along the way, but I can tell you, I can do that with my hands. I remodeled this place into a duplex. It was a single family, and it's under the codes and has passed all that. You know, so, you know, I learned a lot of different things and had an opportunity to do it. And then when I really settled in, I decided I wanted to look at government and consider public service like my dad did. I thought, you know, that was part of my heritage. I might want to do that. And so I thought, where would I really go to gain the knowledge? And I thought, well, I'll go into education, at least in terms of working for the school system, and the biggest ones in Anchorage. And half the state's budget is education. In fact, more than half of the state's budget. In fact, most states, wherever you're listening, and most places around the world, a major portion of government is in fact education, especially at the local level. And at the city level, it's half the city's money too, is all centered on education. So I went to work for the Anchorage School District, and I went to work as a purchasing agent in the maintenance division, which handled all the construction materials and all of that. And I was asked to clean up a mess that had been created there for quite a while. And a bunch of audits had taken place, and a bunch of people had been fired, and new people had been hired, and they had 5,000 line items in their inventory, and they didn't have an inventory, just piles of stuff that needed to be cleaned up and organized. And so I put that all together and did that for a number of years. But 10 months in, and I'm in my 20s, 10 months in, they're going to wipe out this group that's kind of a polyglot kind of group of middle managers as a negotiating group. Kind of had an association there that negotiated with the school district, and they just wanted to wipe us out, make us all executives. And some of us didn't think that was such a great idea given the superintendent at the time, but I was pretty young, and we were in the middle of our elections as a little union organization, not really a union organization at all, but an association. And so I was on the nominating committee, and I couldn't run because I'd only been there, working there 10 months. You had to be there a year. But the nominating committee thought I ought to be running. So when we got back out of there a few days later, we announced the nominees, and then they asked if they would consider, the membership would consider suspending the bylaws and allowing me to run, which they did. And so I ran, and I won that night by 2/3 of the vote. On the platform that we were going to organize as a real union, we weren't going to let the superintendent wipe us out, and we had no law. I mean, there was no laws anywhere except for a little bit of school board policy. So we did, and at 26, I decided to engage that little bit of a battle, and we organized and then affiliated with the American Federation of Teachers and the Alaska Federation of Teachers, AFL-CIO. Went through a big process to do that, and a lot of fighting with the school district over that a bit. But I never looked at it as a fight, just a challenge to get something done, and we did. And then we changed the policies within the school district. We eventually changed the state law as well, so they would recognize us. We also did a lot more there while I was there. We created, at the local and state level, whistleblower laws, where public employees would have a way to go in and identify things that were needed to be fixed, that maybe they were a little uncomfortable with. We also set up, at least in the Anchorage School District, the ombudsman from the city had gained jurisdiction. And an ombudsman, for those that don't know, is kind of an independent person you can go to anonymously, and they have like subpoena power. They can just show up in a government office and dig through the right files and pull the right ones out if they know where to look. So every town should get one. If you don't have one, you should, this is another key, if you will. Ombudsmen are useful. They represent the public's interest when the government fails. You should have them at the local level, cities, counties. You should have them at the state level. You should have them at the national level, so that you and I have an equal playing field, because we don't right now. And as we get into this, if we don't already know it, we will. So at the local level, that works great. It gives you an arbiter that has the power you don't have, and gives employees that are afraid of people that might be above them, that like the status quo, gives them a place to go. Whistleblowing in government should be built into every single governmental institution foundationally. If government's going to be of the people, for the people, and by the people, this is something that needs to be built in. It's one of the keys. It needs to be built in for the private side too, and we'll discuss why. When the private sector does things that violate the public's interest, that violate human interests, there ought to be a way to take that forward without necessarily risking everything you own to do that. And that's the state of affairs. Why public employees don't take those risks often is because of that. Takes 1 out of 1,000 will take that risk. We need mechanisms that provide a bit of a safety net, so the public employee that wants to do the right job has a way to do it when everything is working against them within bureaucracies. That's what I learned within the union movement when I was representing middle managers, the people that know, the ones that run the data processing, the accounting, the payrolls, all of those systems that make things work, those mid-level folks. And then their relationships with people that produce work within production environments, within government. And then there's those above that you could say is that sort of layer that stays, that they're not appointed, so they're there forever. But they often have a very different agenda, especially in the public sector. And even with big organizations, big companies kind of lose their way as their founders disappear and die off, and they just become sort of this corporate thing. So we'll talk a lot about that, again, in the context of experience. But I sat on the Central Labor Council for 10 years, and I was one of the people that actually showed up. Anyone who was there then can tell you. I didn't miss meetings for 10 years. Everybody else did. There's 50, 100 trade unions, and they're missing them all the time and not participating. But I did. I was interested in education policy as it rolls out. I was interested in government accountability. In fact, I wrote a bunch of things about government accountability. Things like upward evaluations, where subordinates, evaluate supervisors. Not that they get to get that data directly. It goes a few levels up. Why? Because people don't even know what's going on within their organizations. I can tell you at local government, these managers that manage these people never even go out and see them half the time. Principals very rarely get in a classroom and see anything that's going on because they're too busy at meetings, and they're supposed to be educational leaders, and they're not. They don't have the time. That's the reality of it. There's a lot that happens within government that you have the perception is happening, and it's not. So as we get through a lot of what we're talking about, even in the context of just talking about my experience or my resume, we're going to get into keys because you can't avoid it. The experience informs me. The experience of gathering a lot of data together by actual experiences, reading, studying, and then taking that into some kind of a form is what it's always been about. The union work, what also is there that I know about, why do people get together and what do unions represent today? They don't represent what they started with. My grandfather, I could tell you about him, and you learned a little bit about him. When he came over to this country in 1906, he had an 8th grade education. He never got any more. He worked underground in mines, and he had a chest, this big around. And in his 80s, I wouldn't have messed with him. Even now, I wouldn't have messed with him in his 80s, late 80s, because he had arms like my legs. If he ever hit you once, you'd never get up. But my grandfather was there when the Pinkertons would come in and start cracking heads when they didn't like what you were doing because $1 a day wasn't good enough to risk your life in a hole in the ground. And so, he was big enough to pick up a baseball bat and do whatever he was doing with everyone else in the 30s, in things that were happening back then. But my dad grew up in that kind of a swill. When I think about, again, the union movement and what I grew up with, my family were strong Democrats in the 60s when Democrats represented organized labor, working people. That's really what the party was. It wasn't all of this other stuff that it is today, because I'm not a Democrat today, but what it was then was that. It was really easy to sort out, and the Republicans were the bankers and the business people. That was easy to sort out. That was it. It wasn't all these social issues, it wasn't all the trade issues, it wasn't all those other issues. It was pretty much that. But it's become something different, and it's become almost tribalism, if you will, and I'll be dealing with tribal issues as we get through, because I have experience there. But in the bigger picture of my family, we're going to get into that too, because we're all over the map. We got the right, the middle, the left, and every configuration you can imagine in my family in terms of the politics and the background. And so that makes it interesting, and as we roll through it, I hope that comes out. AFT, the American Federation of Teachers, was way different than the NEA, the National Education Association, because the association was always, principals were involved. It was kind of a squishy organization. It wasn't really a union. AFT was. But they had an agenda of a different one regarding education. At least that's the way I saw it. And it was the idea of accountability, the idea of independence, the idea of letting teachers teach from the bottom up. And what I was always around was good teachers. I was always around teachers. I mean, that's where my parents were. Both my parents were educators. My mom got her bachelor's. Final exam was being done as she was giving birth to my brother Mark, who became a U.S. Senator. And she's getting her gold rope, but having to take intermission for childbirth. But my family was into teaching and into education, and we valued it a lot, because that was my dad's gateway. First generation American, the old story, the one pair of pants to school and the one for church. Well, that's my dad growing up with his three brothers and his sisters. You know, and growing up in a way where there were no limits, as you know, and there weren't, you know, and he didn't have the money to go to college 4 years, only the money to go to 2, so he did a 4-year degree in 2 years with a 4.0. Because there wasn't any option, get it done, you know. And this is the thing that a lot of us miss, is perseverance counts, makes up for a lot of lack of knowing. If you just keep at it, just keep trying. And that's, when I think about my grandfather, I think about the fact he never really spoke very good English, but boy, did I respect him as a human being, because my dad did. So, I mean, I was taught to respect people, human beings. And this is something we lose too. Someone sounds a little bit different, they look a little bit different, whatever that story is. But that wasn't in my life as a child. That wasn't part of anything. It was so invisible for so many other people. And when I think about, again, going back into the union movement and the work I did, it got me around the state. We ended up organizing in the university. We organized the professors. We organized the state supervisors and merged them into our organization about the time I was heading out of it. But I had learned a lot by then. I had learned quite a lot. And I stayed with the school district in education about 10 years. As I left that is when I started writing, and I was frustrated in the school district. I kept having them whittle away my job. You know, they kept cutting parts of it away because not adding more responsibility, cutting out the time so I had more time. Because I wouldn't do, you know, I'd do my work and then I'd go home and I'd read, and so, or I'd study. So I got them to cut my pay and cut my time rather than take increases, so I'd have more time off. And then they only got it down to a certain point, and they said, we can't cut it anymore, even though we know you can do the job. So I started writing. I decided I would change channels. Now this is another key. Here's a concept for you. I got it from, at that time, my 6-year-old, who said, Dad, why don't you change channels? You know, because he heard me complaining about what I was doing professionally in my work. I just wasn't happy there. And not that I wasn't getting things done, I just wasn't happy doing it anymore. And for me, changing a career wasn't such a difficult thing. I always pursued my curiosity and my interest, and I thought a person should actually love their work, you know, or at least try to. And so this is another, perhaps, a key in all of this. We should try to find employment as close to the things we love doing as possible. And even starting out as a young person, start thinking about, okay, if I can't make my money as an artist, could I make my money maybe as a graphic artist or a sound engineer, or, you know, whatever your art is? Because all of us have an art, and you should find a way to bring your art into your professional life if you can. That brings a great deal of satisfaction, if you can. If you can't, then, I always say this too, if you can't find that mix, then find a way to optimize your labor exchange for money, so you make as much money as possible doing something maybe you don't like very much, so you're freed up to do that which you like with the rest of your life. Because sometimes that's the way it works. But don't do it forever, just do it until the next thing happens. And that's kind of how I approached a lot of my life. You know, a lot of times I did work that maybe someone would say, well, why'd you do that? Well, it was a great experience, all of it. I wouldn't trade any of it, not one breath. It was all worth doing and is worth doing. And I was taught you should actually have a profession and a trade. That came from a guy who was state senator with my dad, Gene Guss, and I thought it was a great idea. If you have a profession and you have a trade, basically that means you're always going to have a job, you know? Not a bad idea. If you can pick up a hammer or pick up a pencil, hey, number one, you can get something done. And that's really what a lot of it has been about. So as I left the union work, and how that happened is I discovered a few things about the teaching union at the national level, and they wanted me there working on other things, and they put me through a lot of training. I negotiated collective bargaining agreements 7 or 8 times. I organized the first coalition of labor within the Anchorage School District, was elected their chairman, saved 240 jobs with a bunch of my colleagues at a time when the leadership wasn't there, and I was that leader in my mid-20s when they weren't there. At a time when the state experienced an oil crash of taking oil from down to $10 a barrel and just destroying this economy in the 80s. And we're going through a destroyed economy again, you know, right now. 40 years later, a generation later, 40 years. When I think about changing channels, that's when I decided that I was going to write. And I wrote an article, the first one about HAARP, which some of you probably saw. It was in Nexus magazine. And they published it right away. It got the attention of a few people. And that led me into meeting Gene Manning, who became my co-author on the book Angels Don't Play This Harp. And that was 1994. That's a long time ago. But that really began most of the public work that I've been involved in. And that resulted in 5 books in English and 9 smaller books in English. And then the main books were translated into 10 languages. And what did that do? I ended up with doing 4,000 radio broadcasts, anywhere from an hour to 3 hours each. I ended up doing 60 documentaries around the world, everyone from BBC, CBC, Travel Channel, History Channel, Discovery, Science Channel. I may go on and on and on, literally around the world. I did 200 lectures and traveled to 44 countries, a lot of times. During that period, ended up in Europe working with the European Parliament on legislation starting in the late 90s. I worked with a lot of groups. We're going to talk about some of that. There was legislation on security and disarmament that deals with HAARP, the High Frequency Active Aurora Research Project, that deal with non-lethal weapons, that deal with weapons that affect the mind and body using electromagnetic fields, actually made into legislation. A lot of the privacy law and some of the information about the security on the internet was from our research. Jim Roderick and I, and he's passed away now, in the 2 books we wrote, Earth Rising and Earth Rising 2. And that legislation, the legislation that came out of that writing was through their science and technology directorates within the European Parliament, that had used our research to help frame the arguments and then our testimony when we later appeared before their committees. So we were able to do some things there that allowed me to work at least on the international level, solving some of this, at least getting it into the mix. The other thing that came of that is I met a lot of people in international development. I had an opportunity to present for the Orthodox Church, actually, in Istanbul, and then I presented in Brussels for a different group, for Globe, which is 200, at that time it was the Globe's 12th General Assembly, and it was the top legislators from 44 governments from around the world. And so and then again, approaching sort of developmental issues, I had an opportunity to do a paper on third world development from a very different perspective than had been followed for probably the last couple thousand years. And I presented that in a conference, and we'll talk about that later in the presentation. But that led me to the kind of the next thing I did within this, because I was doing a lot of these things parallel. I mean, I'm doing the writing and the lecturing, and at the same time I initiate this other work in development, which is kind of running parallel. And then Chief Gary Harrison saw my paper on third world development and said, this would work. We could maybe do this here. And so we talked about that, and we did that. I ended up working for Chickaloon Village. And what I did with Chickaloon Village is I was hired as tribal administrator, and the way the structures work within tribal governments, at least here in Alaska, often is a tribal elder, or in this case a clan grandmother, or perhaps groups of elders in other communities. But in our case it was a clan grandmother, Katie Wade, and then under her was Chief Gary Harrison, and then under him was a council that was elected by the tribal citizens. And then under the council was the administrator, and that was me, to carry on the function of their government within their structure. And so I was their administrator for 5 years, and then their planner for my final year. And then I left Chickaloon, and I worked, had a break from the tribal world, but then I went back and worked for the native village of Tyonek, and also the Tyonek Native Corporation. I was the liaison between the two. They had looked for 2 years to try and find someone they could agree on. and they selected me. On the council level, it was 9 votes out of 9, and on the board level, it was 8 out of 9. And the one who didn't support me eventually did, as we built our relationship together there. But I'll talk more about that and what I did within that world. And then in my own business, I have mining interests here in Alaska today, currently, that we're developing, in real estate interest in rural Alaska, which required me to also have relationships with Ahtna and Chitna Native organizations, corporations within my region. And I have agreements with them that were negotiated independent of my work with the other tribal organizations I've worked with. At the same time, I worked also 4 years with the Lay Institute, and this is, the Lay Institute was set up by Dorothy Lay, and she was one of the heirs to the PepsiCo Frito-Lay family. And so she asked me to be on her board a number of years ago, and I did. I served on her board for 4 years, and in that capacity, essentially, what she wanted to do was talk about the issues I had been talking about, the issues of mind effects, the issues of personal privacy, and all of the technologies that were really forming up against all of us. And so she gave me the opportunity to do that in the auspices of the Institute. It's since then been disbanded, no longer is available to people. But it was a really important 4 years, because in this 4 years I was able to bring together some real experts in this space of mind effects. And we're going to get into that a lot as we get into this today. And we'll talk about what we learned in that conference, because most of the people that participated are dead, but we filmed it, and we're going to make those films available in the coming months. And that'll come through the Hidden Monks platform, perhaps. We'll see how that all rolls up. So the Lay Institute, that was incredible opportunities. We also indexed a lot of my records back then. A lot of my records were moved to the Institute. 44 boxes were shipped to them, and those are gone. I mean, those are history. The other thing that people need to know is that at certain points in my work, I've dropped it for lack of being able to complete it. At one point, I dropped 371 boxes of archive material over at the local dump and recycle center. And this was 10 books that never got written. And they didn't get written because I just flat ran out of time and didn't have the support to get it done. And now it doesn't matter. It's just old information. But I don't want to do that anymore. And that's why we're doing it this way, is to be able to get one feed out and tie a lot of things together. That's what I'm going to try and do today. Just to get the experience and the family background and lay that in has taken us, half the morning. And why? Because context is necessary. I mean, otherwise it's just some guy talking to you. Now, whether you listen to all of this or not, context is necessary, and even within the context are keys. And one of the keys that I want to also mention here is multi-generational knowledge. Why is that important? Let's just think about it for a minute. How many people knew your grandparents? How many people knew your great-grandparents? Right. How many know much about any of them? Not too many. Depending on your culture, because certain cultures it's a whole different deal. Because in certain cultures it's the elders that raise all the kids. So multi-generational knowledge does transfer from someone who has the time to make sure it's transferred. We're not configured that way anymore. Everybody's gone. So who's doing your programming for your children, right? I mean, what goes in is your programming. Who's doing it? It's not you. It's not your spouse, if you have one. It's not your significant other. It's not the grandparents, chances are. It's some institution. Now, the last year or so, it's been you again, if you're the parents, and you've been locked up under COVID. A whole bunch of people are learning a whole bunch about themselves that they didn't know, and they're learning a whole bunch about their families they never knew, and they're learning a whole bunch about people that we didn't know either. But we're doing it in an environment of total frustration, an awful lot of anxiety, and these are opportunities that are present, because what we've been given back a bit of is the most valuable thing that we're ever going to have, time. The time we have in the earth, which is finite. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So it really does have a constraint within it. And so that creates a sense of urgency always that we're going to talk a lot about in terms of the survival urgency that drives so much of what we see even within the world today. So as we think about multi-generational knowledge, start thinking about what are the things that are necessary to pass on? What are the things that you can't trust others to pass on? And start thinking about that. And as a key for your own generation and for your own family history and for the lessons and things that are important, now is the time to think about another key. Picking up a notebook, a simple notebook that you use. And when you think about the keys for your family, the multi-generational information bits that you need to write down, make it convenient to make the note, and then go back and do the job. Write it down. Families that live, royal families, they did this. Do you think they stopped doing it just because they didn't get recognized by the population anymore? Do you think their archives just disappeared? Do you think institutions like the Orthodox Church or the Catholic Church or any other organization dumps their files like I did? Or do they maintain them? And they make sure people understand what they mean. All institutions make sure they understand what they mean. And families that go deep and go back a long way remember. Now, multi-generational knowledge was my brother Tom's thesis in his undergraduate work in history. And that was his observation, not mine. Very important one when I think about it, because we only had my grandfather, a little bit of knowledge about my great-grandparents, but we had my grandparents, all four of them, and my parents. And then my brother did, when my dad disappeared as part of his thing, he traveled 20,000 miles in a car and interviewed all of my dad's close friends and developed and interviewed my grandfather for 30 hours worth of recorded interviews. And he built a lot of knowledge and history. So we had an understanding captured, not lost. And my family does maintain an archive, even to this day, that I contribute to and we all contribute to, because knowledge should be kept and good ideas shouldn't be lost. They should be remembered. So my thought now is this is the medium of the 21st century, the airwaves. Multi-generational knowledge can be preserved here, but only if you record it and store it. And like even in this broadcast, this material is being multi-platformed in a lot of different places. Listeners are going to do the same thing, and I recommend you do it. Use this material if it's useful. Store the material if it's useful. Transcribe it and distribute it. Get it in print if it's useful. We're going to continue to bring information out. We're going to continue to build our archives, but everyone's archives are critical. Everything we build in our lives matters. There are no small things in it. We're going to talk a lot about it. What's really important is we start to realize that there's things we can do to make a difference within our personal lives, and that's where we're going to start today. Instead of starting where I always go, which is like all these issues everyone's so used to, HAARP, mind control, government, Alaska. We're going to get there, but this time we're going to get there with a whole picture of where we're at, where we're headed, and where we go next. And then we're going to dive right in. And the first area after that walk through the library is we're going to talk about consciousness and what that is, and from the standpoint first of quantum physics, and then what does that mean in the broader picture.